I think I discovered the secret of a drawing near place, and that is to have a wonderful lunch like this. So it's wonderful to be here and to get a chance to study together. I prepared texts. Do not panic. We're not going to go through all the millions of pages that I sent out, but I wanted to give you more material than we would have the opportunity to study together. As some of you remember, I came to this congregation virtually in January a year ago, was it? Or whenever. It's hard to measure time. To talk about a book that I wrote with my late husband, Richard Siegel, called Getting Good at Getting Older. So some of you were there, some of you weren't. Just a quick little background about the book. The book came out of a listening campaign that we had at Temple Emmanuel about 10 years ago, when I noticed that the good chunk of the congregants were folks between 60 and, say, middle, healthy 80s, and they were leaving the congregation because they didn't feel like there was anything that we were doing for them. So we had a listening campaign where we talked to about 250 congregants over a course of 6 months in small groups in people's homes, and I asked a new stage, a new life stage. You think about stages of life being biologically given, but they're really socially constructed. Remember that adolescence didn't really exist until the 1920s. I think the first time that word was actually used was sometime in the early 1920s. Why? Because before that, people were children and then they were adults. There wasn't a stage in between. Before the pandemic, there was another new stage that was beginning to be called emerging adolescence. That is to say, when our adult children either came home to live with us or we were still supporting them in some way. That's something that probably didn't happen for most of us in this room. So stages are socially constructed, and here we are in this new stage of life between midlife and frail old age. So we have this listening campaign. We asked people what they thought of this stage of life, what their hopes were, what their fears were. Their fears were that they would become invisible, that they would become isolated, that they would be without purpose, and that they would become dependent. The concerns were all the different concerns that all of us deal with as we grow older. And one of the concerns that kept coming up was, with whom do I want to grow old? And the issue of friendship and how friendship changes over time. So the book, which I encourage you to take a look at, the table of contents of the book is actually issues that came up in these conversations, but over and over again came up the issue of friendship. And so what I want to study with you today is a little bit about friendship. This is not from the book itself, but what does Jewish tradition have to tell us about friendship? Okay? So that's what we're going to do. You have the text in front of you. Can somebody get me a Chumash? At the end of the Joseph story, Joseph brings his father Jacob to meet Pharaoh. This is another part of the Netflix story that probably wouldn't have made it into the movie. But let me just take a quick look. Sorry. I got it. Let's see. It's 43, 5. Okay, I'm having trouble finding what I'm looking for. First of all, you know that when Joseph reveals himself, he says, "Is my father still alive?" He knows that his father is still alive. The question is, what does it mean to be alive? And so the commentaries are going to ask us to think about, you know, when you say that you're alive, what is the quality of life? And then I will find it in the middle. All right. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to skip that. Let's take a look at, so the real question is, what does it mean to be alive? Somebody read the Honey text on number 1. Molly, can you bring it to somebody? Arnie?
Honey was a kind of miracle worker famous for his ability to bring rain. A well-known story in the Talmud begins with an encounter between Honey and an older man planting a carob tree, which takes about 70 years to bear fruit. Honey asks, "Why do you plant it? You won't be around in 70 years. The man responds, "When I came into the world, I found carob trees planted by my ancestors. I plant these for my descendants." Although this is a well-known story, few people read it to the end. Honey falls asleep and sleeps for 70 years. When he wakes up, no one recognizes him. Honey went home and said to the members of the household, "Is the son of Honey alive?" They said to him, "His son is no longer with us, but his son's son is alive." He said to them, "I am Honey." They did not believe him. He went to the study hall, where he heard the sages say about one scholar, "His halachot are as enlightening, as clear as in the years of Honey." For when Honey would enter the study hall, he would resolve for the sages any difficulty they had. Honey said to them, "I am he." But they did not believe him and did not pay him proper respect. Honey became very, very upset, prayed for mercy, and died. Rava, a Talmudic sage, said, "Thus, this explains the folk saying, either friendship or death."
Okay, how many of you know the first part of the story? Right? We teach it to our kids around Tu B'Shvat, right? You know, I came into this world, my ancestors planted for me, I'm going to plant for my children. Beautiful story, everybody loves it. We don't teach the end of the story. You now see why we don't teach the end of the story. Because what starts as a beautiful story turns out to be a very kind of dark story. So somebody tell me in your own words what is going on here. Arnie read it beautifully, but somebody now just unpack it. What's the actual story? Somebody? Okay, Molly?
Oni became isolated.
Okay, but just tell me the story from the beginning. Honi does what?
Goes to sleep for 7 years.
Okay, before he goes to sleep, he sees some guy planting a carob tree. He knows it's going to take 70 years, and he says to the guy, what are you doing this for? It's a waste of time. You're not going to get to see it. The guy says, my grandchildren will see it, okay? And then he falls asleep. This is, if they ever make a movie about this, this is Rip Van Winkle. It's the Jewish Rip Van Winkle. He sleeps for 70 years, and then what happens?
And then no one believes it's him. He asks to see the sun, and they go, Oni's gone. You're not him. He tries to convince everyone that I'm Oni. And they don't believe him.
Nobody knows him. He's invisible, right? Nobody that he knows is still alive. He has no friends, right? And then what does he do? He goes to the study hall. He hears that he is still remembered, right? But nobody knows that it's him. And he is so depressed that he prays for mercy. What does that mean, prays for mercy? He wants to die. The mercy is he's essentially committing suicide, right? And then we learn that there's a folk saying, either friendship or death. U cheruta, u mituta. Okay? Very dark story. By the way, jumping back to the verse I couldn't find, when Joseph brings his father Jacob to meet the Pharaoh, Jacob greets Pharaoh. Pharaoh says to Jacob, how many are the years of your life? How old are you? And what do you think Jacob's response is? The years of my sojourn on earth are 130. Few and hard have been the years of my life, nor do they come up to the lifespan of my fathers during their sojourns. Pretty bizarre. If you were meeting Pharaoh, the last thing you might want to say is, here's how old I am and I've had a really lousy life, right? So this notion of how you tell the story of your life and what it means to say, I'm alive. Okay, so that was the background that I didn't find in a timely fashion. So back to Honi. What is your reaction to this story? And my real question is, have you ever felt any of the things that Honi was apparently feeling? Now this is an opportunity to reveal part of your life. It's not so easy to do, so I'm looking for brave people.
I think this has to do with our sense of relevance. Like, I'm here in this life, and I can plant trees or do whatever I do, but then what? And what is my legacy, and what is my long-term impact on the world, and how many generations out will people know that I existed or know anything about me, or will my life have had any meaning?
So it is a question that some of us are beginning to think about as we grow older, right? What else, what other reactions, or have you ever felt the kind of invisibility, apparently, that Tony was feeling? Arnie?
He's outlived all of his relatives. He's outlived his friends. I mean, they've left him. They're gone, and they're not surrounding him with the family and friends that he had through his life. They're all gone. So his relevance is diminished.
His relevance is diminished, and his social network is diminished, right? Other reactions?
So I'm struck by the fact that his teachings are still important, but he's not.
Right.
And that sense of like what you have said or who you used to be has value, but who you are now, not so much.
Who you used to be has value, but who you are now, not so much. Translation, who am I when I'm not the senior rabbi of Temple Emmanuel of Beverly Hills? Used to be that people return my calls right away. Doesn't happen so much anymore. And it used to be that I had so many friends that I didn't have time to see the people who were my real friends. Not so much anymore. People that I used to work with, although they still love me, I still love them, but we don't get together. The people that I used to, our social networks change as we grow older. How do we deal with that? What other issues emerge from this text for you? Yes?
So my father of blessed memory, I saw that in the last couple of years of his life. Just what you're saying, you know, it's relevant to how he felt as he was unfortunately wasting away. My father of blessed memory, I saw that in his life, in the last several years of his life, where he would start to lose faith in who he was, and then eventually his mind kind of disappeared. But I can certainly see that, and it has affected us.
And you can see that it's affected you, right? And, you know, we're not talking about people who no longer are able to remember. We're talking about people at the stage of their life before that might happen, and that doesn't happen to all of us, it happens to some of us. You know, what might he have done differently? What might friends and family have done differently to have changed the nature of that transitional period in his life? And clearly it's quite an emotional issue for all of us.
So let me restate the story from the point of view of a university professor. I was a
Speak a little louder.
I was a professor at a research university. And so, you know, in almost all the departments, the name of the game was to publish, to discover something or to think of something new and to publish it either in books or articles. And then if they were really good, or if you were really lucky, people would be interested in, other people would be interested in them, or they would teach them. And but articles and books have a very short half-life, 5 years, 6 years, 8 years. And so if you've been a university professor, you know that 10 or 12 years from now, nobody will give a damn about the article that you published in 1975 or something. So if you retire and live long enough, you know that you don't have Honey's experience, because well, unless you're a superstar, you know, like Noam Chomsky maybe 70 years from now, people will still be reading and discussing his things. But for most of us, X years down the road, it's all forgotten, and all the new stuff is what everybody's talking about.
So in a way, Honey actually had it good in that he was remembered through his teaching, whereas for most of us, after a certain period of time, that probably isn't going to happen anymore. A couple more comments. Molly, back there.
In this story, there's an issue of credibility. The people around Honey don't believe that it's possible for him to come back. And they don't want to give him the benefit of the doubt that it might be interesting to talk to him and to make the connection. They don't have the belief, they don't have the trust. And I think he feels betrayed in that they won't give him a chance. He has no proof, he has nothing tangible. If he could show them, see, I had this before I went down or whatever, and it really is me. And I think that's timely now because there's so much fake news and everything.
Interesting.
But these people would not give him a break.
So that's interesting. You know, if I were to move to be near one of my kids, one's in Boston, one is in Portland, nobody would know who I was in Los Angeles. And I could tell them, but it wouldn't mean anything to them. So in a way, that's another version of the Honey story. You know, how do we deal with that kind of invisibility? Okay, one more comment?
From the opposite of the professor, what about the person, and I'm sure we probably all know people, who's, when we think of them, our memory is of a vital, vibrant person who has wonderful stories to tell. I think of my Bubby, when the story she told that we laughed about, and toward the end of her life, who went to visit her? That's frankly, that's what scares me.
Okay, so that's scary, and we're also not talking about your movie, we're talking about you. So, you know, at this stage of our life, right? Last comment?
Well, I think all during our lives, we're being remade, whether it's because of events that happen to you or because of as you go through stages. And Honey, I think, had the opportunity to remake himself. He's not going to be the scholar, he's not going to be the rainmaker, but maybe he had a different purpose to go forward. So I think we all need to realize that we adapted throughout our lives, remade ourselves, and this is just another stage of it's time to remake yourself.
Perfect segue into the next question.
Well, you asked me to do.
Perfect. What might Honey have done so that the story could have had a happier ending?
Well, he could have made rain.
He could have made rain, in California especially.
Right.
Okay, what else could he have done?
Well, make Fred reinvent himself, I suppose.
But how? What could he actually have done?
Well, reach out to other people.
How?
I think that, I don't know. Just, I don't know, befriend, make new relationships.
Okay, how do you make new relationships at this stage? What else could he actually have done? This is a man who clearly, okay, there's somebody who wants to talk back there.
Okay, is it working? Oh, okay. So I can identify with this because I was a teacher, and when I retired, I was so lost. And what did I decide to do? I started tutoring recently. So Honey was a teacher. He could have started teaching again, and maybe that would have brought him into new relationships and find new people and feel satisfied in his life again.
Exactly. He could have repurposed himself. Remember, one of the fears of the folks at Emmanuel was to be without purpose. So I know what my purpose was when I was raising my kids, when I was, involved in the synagogue, but purpose remains important. How do we discover what our new purpose might be given the different circumstances? Honey could have done a lot of other things. Let's go back to the Honey before the story, before the sleep. What can you tell me about Honey? He was a miracle worker. He was clearly, a scholar. In that interaction with the older person planting a tree, what do you notice about Honey that maybe is a little surprising? If you saw somebody planting a tree, what question would you ask?
Rabbi, he's a skeptic.
He's a skeptic?
He's someone who questions about why something is going to happen. Why are you bothering to do this? What benefit is it to you?
What benefit is it to you? Exactly, right? He could have had a different reaction to seeing somebody doing that. What could the reaction have been?
It could have been one of praise.
Could have been one of praise, right? Oh, it's not about you, old man. It's about what you're giving to the world, right? But Honey is already starting from a very self-centered place. Is he benefiting from it or not? He's not. He thinks that it is a waste of time. So just notice that. And as we draw near to our essence, to notice the times in our lives when the story is so much about us that we're not able to see other potential versions of essence. Yes?
I think Honey is also showing his intelligence by realizing that other people have planted before him.
Uh-huh.
And he's sharing the knowledge to the next generation.
But Honey isn't doing that. That's the older man.
That's the gentleman he's talking to.
Honey is the one who questions that, right?
I take that back.
So Honey is the one who questions that, right? But he could have done that, right? He could have looked around and said, oh yeah, wow, my ancestor did this for me, but he didn't.
See, isn't there a missed opportunity here? Because, my takeaway from the story is he fell asleep. his life passed him by. He missed out. He was so wrapped up in this that he didn't understand. And when he woke up 70 years later, his life was over. He had missed everything in between.
So, such an interesting comment. He missed everything in between. He comes back to a world that he doesn't quite get. We all live in a world, I'm speaking personally here, that we don't quite get. That our millennial children get in a way that we don't quite get. And we maybe try to get it, or maybe we say, oh, all that screen time, it's all bad. What are we sleeping through? And what would it mean as we notice now that perhaps the possibility of reinventing ourselves might involve a different kind of intergenerational connection where we acknowledge, you know, I've been a little bit of asleep. What can you teach me? One of the things that I've learned a lot in this getting good at getting older space that I've been involved in as I go around the country virtually talking about the book is that we struggle with making these kinds of connections and acknowledging that it's not about us and what we knew in our day. You know, we sang this beautiful song, L'Ador Vador. The message of L'Ador Vador is, from me to Molly, right? I have wisdom, and I'm going to pass it on to this next generation. And I think that maybe one of the things about being awake is to really listen to Molly or my kids, and you know, what are they able to teach me? That's something new, I think, for Jewish tradition. We don't usually think of that door, door, that it goes in both directions. And what would it mean if we intentionally tried to do that? In this extraordinary synagogue that you have, to make that a conscious intention as the synagogue creates itself as being a place of drawing near. It's an interesting thing to think about, and it's a kind of new thing. I don't think that people have been thinking about that before. And this is particularly important around the climate change issues. You know, many of us in the 60s were involved in all kinds of social change stuff. It was very difficult during the pandemic with the Black Lives Matter that we couldn't be out on the streets demonstrating. We would have been when we were younger. What does it mean for us to be able to say, it's not my turn anymore? I need to enable this next generation of leaders, and I need to listen that in the climate change stuff, we haven't done such a good job. What would it mean for us to really listen to those people, our own kids, who are saying to us, you know, we have to do better and we have to find a way to do it together. So I think the Honey story asks this, and we'll take one more comment and then we're going to move on, okay? Somebody who hasn't spoken before, yes?
Not a comment, but it's a question.
Okay.
We talk about repurposing. If we go ahead and learn from these younger generations, we open our minds and our hearts and all of that, basically, we can still be active in it.
Exactly.
Correct?
Yes.
It's stepping aside.
That's right. We can still be active, but we're not necessarily leading anymore, or we're not leading the way we did. I mean, it's interesting, you know, the book, Getting Good at Getting Older, is a reflection of the Jewish catalog that many of you remember that was written in 1973. My late husband, Richard Siegel, was the co-editor of that book. And the book is about what life was like in the 60s and 70s, right? And it was a book about that generation, us, taking over our own Jewish life, and not depending on authority, but, you know, a kind of do-it-yourself Judaism. 1973, it captured a moment. It was it didn't create the moment, it captured a moment. So that was the 60s and 70s. Well, now we're in our 60s and 70s, and it's a new world. How are we admitting that it's a new world, and to what do we need to be awake? I think that's a challenge. We're going to move on, because otherwise my friend will be mad at me for talking too long. So number 2, the classic text of Jewish tradition about friendship. Molly, somebody's going to raise his or her hand. Yes. Oh, sorry. Somebody just read.
Yoshua ben Parachia said, provide yourself or make yourself with a Rav. Acquire for yourself a Chaver and judge every person favorably.
Okay, the classic text about friendship from Pirkei Avot, translated as the sayings of our ancestors, the sayings of our fathers, but probably more accurately understood as essential teachings. Pirkei Avot actually really means essential teaching. So this is an essential teaching about friendship, okay? I don't want you to answer what this means. I want you to tell me what questions this text raises for you. Okay, you look at it. Provide for yourself a Aseh lecha Rav. Kaneh lecha Chaver. Acquire for yourself friend. Judge every person favorably. What questions emerge? Yes?
What does it mean to acquire yourself a friend?
What does it mean to acquire? Okay, good. Other questions?
Do all these things go together? Is this one person or is this multiple people?
Great question. Are you looking for two different people? Are you looking for the same person? What else? What other questions?
What is a friend?
What is a friend? Good. What else? Maybe you could even shout out some of these answers.
And what does judging every person mean?
What does judging every person mean? Favorably. Judging every person favorably. What does that mean? What other question do you have about that right here?
Does everyone deserve to be?
Okay, what does this mean? What is it doing here? Does it have anything to do with friend, with teacher? The rabbis believe that this stuff was connected because it was connected in some ways. Is it connected, or are these two completely different notions? Yes?
So is it necessary to judge every person favorably in order to...
Good question. Is it necessary to judge every person favorably in order to make for yourself a Rav and to acquire for yourself a friend? What other questions? Yes? Good question. Is it the same person, or is it causative? If I have a good Rav, whatever that means, does that mean that I'm going to also be able to have a good friend? Other kinds of questions?
Is it a correlation? You build one from the other.
Okay, are they connected? Do you build one from another? Okay? And notice the, what does it mean, aseh lecha? Make for yourself, to yourself, of yourself, right? We saw in Vayigash alav, and he drew close to him, which the Sfat Emet read as to yourself, right? So what does the lecha here mean? Are you supposed to make yourself a Rav, yourself a friend? All of this is like embedded in this text, and it isn't answered. Okay? So just notice that connection. And now I just want to ask you to now reflect on your own answer to the question, what does judge every person favorably have to do with these other two things? Or does it? Anybody? Yes?
So I think if we offer a generous interpretation, if we assume the people around us are doing their best, and we're looking for the good in them, we are much more likely to find people who we might want to be our teachers and our friends. If we're looking at them with judgment and not generosity, then we tend to see the negative, and we're much less likely to find those connector points.
Okay, so that's a good point. As you imagine this being a drawing near place, approaching, how does this issue of judgment come into play as you create and deepen this community? Somebody tell me a story of a friend who, when you first met that friend, you didn't like that friend at all because of whatever, and that changed over time. Does anybody have like a story they could share? Anybody who hasn't talked?
Who wants to talk about their spouse?
When Albert and I moved to Milwaukee, we got invited to a friend's house for a birthday party, and we got there and we thought, oh my goodness, these people are so much cooler than us. And we did a millennial thing. It's embarrassing to say, but we ghosted the party. We left. We didn't think anybody would notice, and we thought, oh, we won't be friends with these people. They turned out to be our closest friends in Milwaukee.
So not judging or judging, has consequences. And just to notice that, why might they even have included it together, assuming that this was an intentional inclusion? What is the warning here?
I think the phrase judge every person favorably is another way of saying be open to the idea that you can learn from almost anyone of almost any bent. It could be a little tiny Rob, a little notion that you get on one conversation, or it could be a lifelong teaching experience. But if you're not open, it ain't going to happen.
So I think that's a really important and very difficult thing at this moment in time, as people have so many very strong feelings about what's happening in our world. And some of us find ourselves in conversation with people who have completely different views about what's true. And, I don't need to go into this. You all are living with it, right? The challenge, I think, is to go into that conversation really trying not to judge somebody. Is there something you can learn from somebody who really has a different way of seeing the world or not? I think that's a real question. And in the course of building community, it's a particularly important question, because in theory you don't want anybody to feel unwelcome in your community, even though maybe you do, and so just to kind of notice how complicated that is. What other question might you have asked about provide yourself a friend or acquire for yourself a chaver? How would you describe that instruction? Yeah?
You look for the good in every person that you meet within your community, and you'll tend to find the goodness that will help bring you out also.
Look for the good, but it doesn't tell you that. It just gives you an instruction. What is missing with an instruction? How to do it. How do you do that, right? Okay, I understand that I'm supposed to make for myself a rabbi, acquire for myself a friend. Okay, now tell me how to do it. Well, here's how to do it. Do you want to talk and then read?
I was going to talk, but I'm happy to read too.
Good, first talk.
Okay, great. I think it's asking us to be proactive about something that we often think just happens by magic, right? Like, oh, I happened to meet this great person and they became my friend. We think of friendship as something that occurs naturally in just the right setting or just the right circumstance. Instead, this is asking us to say, go out and find it, go out and do something for yourself.
Very good point. A really very good point. Now you
do you want me to read something?
Yes.
Yeah, what should I read? Number 3?
You should read number 3, which is, it's not exactly a commentary on Pirkei Avot, but now they're trying to figure out, looking only at the phrase, acquire for yourself a friend.
Okay.
Kanei lecha chaver.
Acquire for your...
Go ahead.
Acquire for yourself a friend. How so? This teaches that a person should get a companion to eat with, drink with, study with, sleep with, and reveal secrets. The secrets of the Torah and the secrets of worldly things.
I love this text. You now find this text often on wedding invitations, right? Because it seems to be a relationship between beloveds. That sleep with, that's the thing that makes you think that. But that's probably not what our ancestors had in mind with Pirkei Avot. I think, remember in those days, whenever those days were, men, this is a text directed to men studied together, they went off and lived in whatever the yeshiva was or wherever people studied, and there weren't a lot of beds and people shared beds. I think this is not a sexually intimate phrase, although I might be wrong and there are people who read it differently. But it's a kind of intimacy, you know. You go to a hotel with a bunch of your women friends and a bunch of you are sharing beds because you don't have enough money to buy two different, I mean, you know, it's not necessarily sexual, but it is intimate, right? But so what is the instruction? How do you acquire a friend? Or, yeah, how do you acquire a friend? What do you have to do? When it's not, I mean, specifically, what do you have to do? What does it say? Spend time together. Tell me exactly what the steps are. Eat. You go out to lunch, right? Drink. What does that mean? Probably means have a glass of wine, right? Because first time you're eating and then the next time you're a little more loose, you talk a little bit more, right? Study with. What does study with have to do with friendship?
You make yourself vulnerable.
In the days, the Talmudic days or whatever, when people studied, when you had a study partner, you became very close.
Exactly. And by the way, I think that happens here. I think that when you study together, we modeled it a tiny little bit with the Chavruta study. You know, when you actually turn to a person and you talk about a text, what you're actually sharing is your life, the Torah of your life in response to the Torah of that text, right? Torah study is incredibly intimate. And a good community gives you the opportunity for that kind of close connection. Rabbinical students, rabbis, we are encouraged, trained, not exactly required, to have a chavruta, a study partner that we study with on the phone once a week. You pick a text. Why? Because it's an intimate connection. More than eating, more than drinking, I mean, more than eating with a friend, more than drinking with a friend, studying with a friend. And then you get to the place where you get that kind of intimacy that we are using as a, you know, sleep with. And then you get to the stage of revealing secrets. Secrets of the Torah and secrets of worldly things. It's a pretty moving text, I think. Yes?
I was going to say, all of these speak to allowing yourself to be vulnerable.
Exactly. Right. Well, maybe not eating with. I mean, maybe. But, you know, vulnerability, right. And by the way, Vayigash, and he drew close. However he drew close, however you understand it, looking for a fight, conciliation, or prayer, or kiss the person that you're vulnerable. You know, if in fact Rashi's read is a legitimate read, Judah was making himself very vulnerable by looking for a fight with the most powerful person in Egypt, right? So vulnerability is an important part of friendship. Yes.
And today, at Concept's Day, we make ourselves vulnerable when we eat together. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting, right? Right. I mean, that's so interesting, right? How you measure safety and vulnerability, you know, or how do you eat together when you're not actually able to be in the presence of somebody that you're eating with? Okay, one more comment?
Well, and I also think there's a reason why so many celebrations or memories in the Jewish community start with food and eating with a community, because then you're able to build upon all of these other things that start with food and at the core.
Exactly, right. I must say I'm not a cook myself. I'm an eater but not a cooker. And I am so interested in how much food has become such a central theme during this pandemic. We have a program through our village, Chai Village LA, a partnership between my synagogue and another Reform synagogue. And it used to be called Dinner and Dessert. And now it's called Dinner Without Dessert. But before the program, the person who is the creator of the program, a lay person in our community, sends out a recipe and encourages people to make it, and so they're eating all the same thing. I mean, you know, wow, it's not something that I would do, but whoever is making some of those sweets, I wouldn't mind somebody that I know knowing those recipes. So I think that is very interesting. We all have a colleague, Debbie Prinz, who has repurposed herself after she left a wonderful career working for the Central Conference of American Rabbis, writing a book about chocolate and about Jews and chocolate. and now about Jews and baking or something, right? I mean, interesting. Rob Eshman, who some of you know if you read the foreword, has this blog about Jews and food. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff about that that I think is very important. Okay, moving right along to the real core text that, again, if we had more time, this would be the opportunity for a real intimate study. Maimonides, this is number 4 on page 2. Maimonides explains Pirkei Avot, acquire for yourself a friend, based on levels of friendship. He argues that the lowest level of friendship is friendship based on mutual benefit, such as the relationship of 2 business partners. Give me an example of another friendship that's based on mutual benefit. Yes?
I was going to say between 2 mothers, especially with school-age children, because you take turns watching.
Exactly.
Or you're helping each other with childhood issues.
Carpool.
Carpool.
Exactly, right? Mutual benefit, right?
Sports team.
A sports team, maybe. Okay, mutual benefit. They're my friends, those women that I used to share carpool with, but it wasn't, you know, it was one level of friendship, right? The second level is friendship based on pleasure. What is that? Say again? Different kind of benefits, right? But what is a friendship that's based on pleasure? It's that, you know, I like opera. Arnie likes opera, and we go to the opera together. That's a friendship that's based on pleasure. Are we intimate friends? Probably not, but we get to talk about opera, and in my life, I don't have anybody else to go to opera with. So it's a friendship that's based on pleasure, okay? Say again? We eat chocolate together, okay. The third level is friendship based on security. Each person finds in the other someone whom he can trust, someone with whom he can let down his defenses and share all profound matters and innermost thoughts, good and bad, without fear. How do you respond to that level of friendship?
I think that's what the previous text meant about sleeping.
Okay.
It was about trust.
Okay, about trust. And I think when we use the word friend really, that's what we're talking about, right? That's the level of friendship. When we think about who our really good friends are, that's who we think about, right? The fourth level, the highest level of friendship. Both friends yearn and aspire for true good, where each partner feels responsible for helping the other to grow in self-understanding. How do you react to that?
Friends you can be honest with.
Well, friends you can be honest with, I think, are the third level.
But like where you can tell them if there's something that, like where you can tell them, like a friend who sends a sermon to me and I can say, ooh, it really doesn't work, instead of, yeah, that's beautiful.
Okay, pushing you to be a better version of yourself, right? I think that's true. Do you really want it? You want your rabbi to be sending her sermons to her friends to critique them. My study that I did this morning, that was a third iteration. I have one friend that I send everything to. She said, it's not working, you have to redo it. It's not working, you have to redo it. And then I didn't even get to send her this one because I was so late in finishing it. So I have to, you'll tell me whether I got it or not. I'll tell her. But, you know, do I really want that, or is good enough, right? Do you want a friend who's going to really push you? And do you want to push other people to be the best versions of themselves? I think that's a question. Yes?
So I am currently the Bulletin Editor for the Temple. And one thing that we say a lot in the office, as well as around the Bulletin, is that everyone deserves an editor. It's not just about somebody picking apart your work. It's about the fact that you're both trying to achieve something good together. And so everybody deserves to have an editor to be able to support them and really achieving that idea, as opposed to telling you that you're not doing it right.
Okay, so you would want that, okay?
What bothers me about these lists is the notion that everything is in a hierarchy. And you see that in a whole lot of things, and quite frankly, it's almost always men who are creating these hierarchies. And I don't think in terms of hierarchies. Whenever somebody says, well, what's your favorite something, or what was the best part about that trip, I don't think that way. I don't think in terms of hierarchies. And the thing about friendship is that relationships change. So that you could start out as a friend who have, it's based on mutual benefits. Maybe you carpool together, but then later that develops into something else. Or you could be intimate friends at some point and really have a trusting relationship, and somehow that changes and fades over time. So to have this kind of hierarchy and that we peg everybody into these little boxes is not helpful to me.
I think that's a great comment. I still think it's helpful. By the way, Maimonides is a famous guy for lists, right? He's the guy that gave us the ladder of tzedakah, right? And by the way, if he were still running the world the way he wanted to, I don't know how you would raise any money in Beverly Hills at all if people don't, they don't do it anonymously. So I think that Rabbi Dreyfus's point about it not necessarily the only way to look at things. The question is there something here that is helpful as we think about friendship? Not that we don't have to agree with him, but is there something in this way of thinking that is useful? And I think that's the question. I want to move on to exactly what that challenge is, but before I do, any more thoughts about this highest level of friendship? Is that what you want? I mean, there's some part of me, I'm being honest here, I'm 71 years old. I'm probably not going to change that much now. Do I really want a friend who says, you have to change that about yourself? I mean, maybe I do, maybe I don't. I think we've all had friends that we have tried to say something like that with, and it's not exactly worked. So I think it's just, again, it's a matter of discernment to notice, is that what you want? Is that how you want to be with your friend? Yes?
You like this notion of an editor, or it really bothers me. I think of M. Scott Peck, who wrote The Road Less Traveled. He talks about...
Say it again?
M. Scott Peck, who wrote The Road Less Traveled, he talks about nourishing the ones, nourishing their spiritual growth and walking with them, and not necessarily guiding the path one way or the other, but just being with. And when someone that I care about is ill, can I stop off at the pharmacy and get you something that you need? Do you need a prescription, or can I go to the grocery store? And I allow them their process. To me, that's being.
But what he's suggesting is that you feel responsible for helping the other to grow in self-understanding. That's different from being present to a friend who's sick. That's saying to somebody, I want to be present. I want to feel responsible for helping you grow. But do I want that? And do you want that? And do I want to do that with my friends who maybe are not so interested in spiritual growth?
I think, speaking to Nina's point, sometimes being that kind of friend, it's kind of like being a good therapist. Are you going to help somebody to grow? I'm a therapist. So am I going to help someone to grow by saying, no, you're not doing that right, you have to do it this way? Or am I going to help someone grow by helping them develop trust in me, by kind of being with them along the journey, and maybe gently asking them some questions to get them to think about things? I think that's a whole different level.
I do too, and I wonder if it's the analogy to a therapist is the same as the analogy to a friend. Do you want from your friend what you might want from a good therapist?
In a very gentle way, a friend can ask you kind of what you want is what you're doing, kind of commiserate with what you say you want. Yeah, I think that would be
Okay,
great.
good.
But I think to force the issue.
Okay, good. All right, a couple more points, and then we're going to move.
I think that the difference between a therapist and a friend is the therapist is one direction in that relationship. And would I want someone like that? Only one.
Okay, so that's interesting. What we are not talking about, but we should, if we've not been sleeping over the past 70 years, is what it means to be a friend on Facebook, and how we use that same word, and what does that mean? Material for some to think about as we talk about friendship. Okay, the last comment, and then we're going to move directly to Rabbi Dreyfus's question point. Yes?
Well, I'm still back at the friend-therapist conversation because I'm also a therapist. There are a lot of us here. So I was going to say what Barbara said about it's not bi-directional, but also I think, you know, what I get personally out of being a therapist, besides it's how I make my living, the emotional needs that needs are very different than the emotional needs that I get met in a friendship.
That's interesting.
Probably because it's reciprocal, and because there's sort of a contractual arrangement as a therapist, right? People come to me saying, I have things I need to work out, and I believe you have the skills to help me do that. My friends don't say that, right? My friends are my friends because there's some connection, emotional, spiritual, experiential, and it's a different kind of arrangement.
Okay, so we're going to you're going to continue this conversation offline because it's an important conversation. I want to get back to the challenge that Rabbi Dreyfus posed. And here's what we would have done if this were a smaller workshop and we had more time. You see that I would ask you how you respond to Maimonides' levels. And then I want you to think about how your friendships have changed over time. It's exactly what Rabbi Dreyfus suggested. And do you look for different qualities in a friend now than you might have at an earlier stage of your life, or frankly, at a later stage of your life? So that's something for us to think about as we inhabit this new stage of whatever we call it. There's not actually a word for it. It's not, I'm not a senior. I don't like that word particularly. I'm not an elder. I'm not, this phase between midlife and frail old age. This is my encore phase. This is senescence is a word that some scholars are using, like adolescence and, you know, what, we don't even know what we call ourselves, but the golden years, you know, say again? You know, I am a seasoned adult. That's true. Anyway, but so do I look for different qualities of friendship now? And I think it's important to notice that, actually, because part of the issue of being visible or invisible, you know, when I was starting my career, what I looked for in relationships, or one of the things I looked for, were people that would help me succeed, you know, mentors. And it's different now at this stage of my life. So just to notice these kinds of things are important. So here's what I would ask you to do, and I encourage you, Shabbos afternoon or sometime when you have absolutely nothing else to do, to look at this friendship grid and to take a look at who your friends are now and to put them in these categories. Who are the friends now for mutual benefit? Who are the friends now for pleasure? Who are the friends now for security and trust? And who are the friends now for encouraging the best version of self? And then I want you to look at who's on the list. And notice if there are some people that are in more than one category. And then ask yourself, how many friends do I actually really need? And how is it changing? And one of the ways to do that is to do the exact same thing about friends who used to be your friends. Do the same thing in the past, this right-hand column, and just look at who used to be on the list and isn't anymore. And also look at that list and ask yourself, you know, maybe this is the time to reach out to that person. You know, one of the really interesting benefits, if you can use the word, of the pandemic is a lot of us reached out to friends that we didn't, we could have done it before. Zoom existed before, but how many of you, just to raise your hand, are in connection with people that you had sort of dropped out of touch with because suddenly somebody was organizing a reunion, or because of women rabbi colleagues getting together to talk about a crisis? How many of you have had that experience during the pandemic? Raise your hand. Of reconnecting with somebody that you didn't know before, or that you hadn't been in touch with. Yeah, so somebody who hasn't spoken, tell us what that was like, that reconnection. Anybody? Raise your hand. Who hasn't spoken? Somebody who hasn't spoken? Okay, then somebody who has spoken.
I ended up in touch with a friend from high school who I hadn't talked to in probably close to 40 years. With state, and she ended up coming to visit and stay with me for several days. And the connection was just like it was in high school.
Amazing, isn't it? Amazing, right?
I think we look for empathy at this point because of shared life experience. I remember going to high school doing it.
A little louder.
I think we look for empathy and shared connections. I remember going to a high school reunion, before the pandemic, and there were people that, we barely knew each other at that time, but we were at the same, we had shared experience, we were age cohorts, and we'd gone through several things together, maybe marriages, children, losses, and there was common ground. And I think at this point, we all look for common ground, we look for something familiar. And with so much loss that COVID has brought, it has severed connections as much as it has brought them about. We look for any kind of connection that we have that may have been forged earlier or that we can forge now, but where there's common ground of any kind, where we can build on empathy and communication. And it's not possible with everyone, but it is possible with some.
So I think that's true. And I think it's just interesting to notice. And as we move out of the pandemic, God willing, how are we going to continue to nurture those relationships or to discover new ones of people that we used to know? In the interest of time, I want to just show you what we're not talking about. The next page begins to talk about why friendship has been even harder during the pandemic, and specifically about the epidemic of loneliness. It turns out that before there was a pandemic, there was an epidemic of loneliness, and it turns out that the metrics for health and longevity are way better for people who are not lonely. And the extent to which loneliness exists, not just in active older adults and frail old age, I think in your name? Andy. In Andy's description of his father, that was part of the issue, I suspect, right? It turns out it's a huge issue for millennials, kids who are out of college. Loneliness is just as high in that age cohort as it is in ours and older. This is a serious issue. And that's what's on page 3 and 4. And then on page 4, there are some tools about issues of friendship at all stages of life, but as well as now. And what follows, here's what I did. I went online and I looked up how to make a friend, how to deal with toxic friends. I'm not, I'm not an expert on any of this, but there's a ton of stuff online. And there are tools. Some stuff that was interesting for me. If you want friends, the 4 elements are: there needs to be proximity, frequency and duration, intensity. Proximity, frequency, duration, and intensity. Right? Now, during the pandemic, that's difficult because there wasn't a lot of proximity. But, you want to make a friend, you have to be close enough to be able to interact. You have to do it for a certain amount of time, a certain number of times, right? You have to do it for a certain amount of time, and then the intensity follows. I mean, these were just interesting categories to think about if you think about friendship. And I would have asked you, how, now on page 5, how this friendship formula resonates with you now. So one of the issues that has come up as I've spoken around the country to people who live in buildings, like in New York, they used to make friends because they would see them in the elevator, or they would see them picking up the mail. And over a certain number of times of that, you get to know that you go out to, you know, and eventually you are metaphorically sleeping together or studying together, right? That isn't happening if you can't do that. So as we come back to life together, as you all in this community come together, the frequency, the duration of the connections, the intensity, this is all stuff to think about. Okay, how do you make new friends? That's an issue at this stage of our life. That's what's on page 5. There's other stuff about how to get rid of friends, you know, toxic friendship, which, by the way, is a serious issue, right? Many of us have friends that don't nurture us. At what point do you say, it's enough already, there's less time ahead than there was behind, I don't want to surround myself with people that suck energy from me. But then how do I get rid, how do you let down, how do you not respond to somebody who's been in your life for a long time? This is a more and more significant issue for many of us as we really begin to do this friendship grid and recognize that so-and-so not really helpful and I don't really want to continue it. There's more of this stuff in the book, which is actually a toolkit about specific things that you might want to do about meeting new friends and letting go of toxic friendships, nurturing old friends, intergenerational connections. There's nothing in the book really seriously about intergenerational connections. If I were to write the book again, that would be a huge chapter. If I were also to write the book again, there would be a huge chapter on technology, which we didn't even consider because it was written before the pandemic. Okay, we're going to conclude now on page 7. This text from Betty Friedan. I found this fascinating. Betty Friedan, you all know, the Feminine Mystique, 1963. In 1993, she wrote a book called The Fountain of Age. As far as I know, she was one of the first people to talk about this stage. Now there's a lot of stuff about this stage of life. Wonderful stuff, some not so wonderful stuff. But I think Betty Friedan was the first person to kind of name this stage in a book called The Fountain of Age. In it, she wrote, more and more, psychologists have found that for older persons, loneliness is not necessarily linked to the death of a spouse or to how infrequently they see their children or grandchildren, but to the absence of personal relationships with peers, friends of their own age or any age, who share their interests and with whom they sustain their roots of shared experience. I found this really significant. The other thing that I would have written about, if I would redo the book, is about solo aging, right? I became a solo ager when my husband died. That was a surprise, we didn't expect it. All of a sudden I joined this vast network. Unfortunately, it is more a sorority than a fraternity, right? Because women tend to outlive their partners if they have male partners. And all these issues are more complicated. And by the way, the pandemic was also more complicated. So the people in your community who are solo agers, you know, particular care, it needs to be, you just need to notice that. But so Betty's notion that friendship is even more important to me now. You know, I am not a solo ager technically. A solo ager technically doesn't have a partner and doesn't have children. Many of us have children, but they don't live near us. Others of us have children and grandchildren, but we don't have the kind of relationship with them that we wish we had, so that they're not necessarily in our lives in the way we want them to be. Friends are really important. How do you honor that? One of the things I might have said when I spoke to you all virtually is I think that our tradition, which notices that a mourner is a technical category of a parent, a spouse, a child, or a sibling, misses the truth to which friends are also mourners. And, to be able to acknowledge that and to grant to a close friend who's lost a friend the status, the attention, the ability to say Kaddish, to have a Shiva, whatever it is, that's something I think that we ought to be thinking about as a Jewish community. And here again, this issue of intergenerational connections. Friends of their own age or any age, how can you cultivate an intergenerational community? I just want to tell you a little moment about myself. So after Richie died, I decided that I hated being alone. And I reached out to the Hebrew Union College, which is in Los Angeles, and I posted, I'm looking for a tenant. And I've had a series of wonderful students from HUC living with me, and this year I posted again. And I got an email from a couple. I don't have a big house. It's a nice house, but it's not a big house. A couple saying, will you consider a couple? And I thought, sure. And then they said, we don't just want to rent. We want to share your house. They're rabbinical students, fourth-year students. We met over the summer a bunch of times on Zoom, and we talked about what it would mean to actually share the house. They have their own room and bathroom. I have my own room and bathroom, but all the other spaces in the house are shared spaces. How do we negotiate that? Who gets to have friends over? Whose parents get to come and visit in the guest room? And when we made the deal with each other, my son, who is a nonprofit manager, said, Mom, you have to have a lease. Have a lease. But we said, we have to have a covenant. And we wrote a covenant of what it means to share a house. And I must tell you, it's been fascinating. I mean, there are pieces of it that are ridiculous. And there are pieces of it that are incredibly moving. I come home from Shabbos dinner wherever I am, and the house is filled with young people singing whatever, and I get invited to sit at the table. Or I have friends over, and they're included if they want to be or not, and I learned new apps about how you share costs of food, something called Splitwise. I mean, it's been a real experience. Some of you in this community might have spaces in your house, and you might want to think about shared housing. There now are apps that help you find the right person if you're not lucky enough to live next to a university or a college where you might find an appropriate partner. So that whole question of intergenerational friendships, huge. Okay, in conclusion, no surprise that our tradition has blessings related to friendship. And here are the blessings. If you see a friend that you haven't seen for over a year, you say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, mechayeh hametim. Blessed are you, Holy One of Being, who revives the dead. Now, either those rabbis had a sense of humor, because that's what it feels like, or maybe it's because, you mourn a parent for a year, whatever, but I just thought that was like an amazing notion, that it is true that when you see somebody, you meet somebody that you used to know years ago, there is a sense of sort of, wow, oh my God, resurrection, right? And if you see a friend that you haven't seen for a month, you say the Shechianu. So in conclusion, I want to say the Shechianu for my friend that I haven't seen for well over a month and probably even over a year, but it's hard to know with Zoom, because Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, she'achianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu l'zman hazeh. Thank you all for learning with me, and I look forward to those of you who are going to come tomorrow, where we're going to talk about issues of women rabbis.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Geller. Thank you. I don't even know what else to say. You are amazing, and what a blessing. And to be able to share you with this community is just beyond. Yeah, let's give another round of applause. So something that we talked about a lot during the interview process, but now I get to see it played out, is that this is a congregation that moves chairs and clears plates and cleans up after ourselves. So let's give a round of applause to everybody who prepared this beautiful meal. And if you are able and willing, we would definitely take your help in cleaning up. So thank you and Shabbat Shalom.